In 1970, Dennis Banks recruited Leonard Crow Dog, a Lakota medicine man, as the spiritual leader of A.I.M. Because A.I.M was composed of many urban Indians seeking a reconnection to their heritage, Crow Dog was an essential component in bridging the gap between urban and reservation Indians. In 1972, the leader of the Alcatraz occupation, Richard Oakes, saw a YMCA camp leader being rough with an Indian boy. Oakes confronted the manager, named Michael Morgan. Morgan's response was to pull out a handgun and fatally shoot Oakes. Morgan was only charged with involuntary manslaughter for his murder of Oakes. Various Indian groups were understandably outraged, and this served as the impetus for the Trail of Broken Trees, which united these various groups in a caravan driving all the way from the West Coast to Washington, D.C. The caravan was 4 miles long, and it arrived in D.C. just before Election Day. The plan for the caravan was to present a 20-point proposal for improving U.S.-Indian relations. And basically, the 20 points more or less relate to reopening treaty discussions between the U.S. government and the American Indians. While in D.C., A.I.M went to the headquarters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to speak with the BIA commissioner, Louis Bruce, about lodging for their tribal elders. Louis Bruce was sympathetic to A.I.M, but was instructed to withhold any open support for them by the head of the Bureau of Land Management, which is over the Bureau of Indian Affairs. His name was Harrison Loesch. Loesch was highly regarded by private mining and timber interests because the previous year he had approved leases on 90,000 acres of Apache land. Loesch had ruled that the environmental impact statements required by the National Environmental Policy Act were not needed for Indian territory because it was not public land. When A.I.M entered the BIA simply asking for lodging, a riot squad was called in and immediately began beating many of the Indians. A.I.M members barricaded themselves into the building, and an impromptu occupation began which lasted 5 days. During this time, A.I.M members ransacked files looking for documentation of mistreatment of Indians by the Bureau and claimed that they found them in abundance. One of the occupiers was named Leonard Peltier, a part Chippewa, part Sioux Indian from the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. Peltier describes a moment when one old grandfather, a victim of the BAI throughout his life, took an axe, jumped up on the BIA commissioner's big mahogany desk, and split it in two. He laughed and wept ecstatically all the while, singing his death song, "There, take that and that," he cried between his gasps and chants, righting an ancient wrong with every blow. It was beautiful. He was crazy horse incarnate at that moment. Embarrassed and not wanting to authorize a massacre on the eve of Election Day, Nixon sought to sweep the incident under the rug as quickly as possible. The government gave $66,000 to the Indians and assisted them in leaving Washington. The government's attitude towards A.I.M changed swiftly after the BIA occupation, and all federal aid was withdrawn from the survival schools. In the East, support for Indians was too strong, which made it difficult for the government to prosecute any of the occupiers. But in the Midwest, where the white population was still very much racist toward the natives, A.I.M could be targeted easily. This is just what the FBI did under the designation COINTELPRO. The place they zeroed in on was the desperately poor reservation in South Dakota called Pine Ridge. Leonard Peltier was among the first targeted when two plainclothes cops provoked him into confrontation. Before any blows were struck, the two agents had pulled their guns on him, and they arrested him, put him in the back of a police van, and while they were ruthlessly beating him, they discovered a handgun on him. A handgun which he had just purchased and was as yet inoperable. Despite this, the officers claimed that he had pulled the gun on them and attempted to fire. In February of 1972, an Oglala man named Raymond Yellow Thunder was beaten for fun by two white brothers. Raymond was stripped and paraded around before a patriotic gathering at the American Legion dance in Gordon, Nebraska. The brothers then stuffed him in the trunk of their car and drove around for a while before dumping him in a field. Raymond died the next day, but his body was not discovered until a week later. The offenders were arrested and promptly released without bail. They were charged with second-degree manslaughter, and it was very likely that the charge would have been dismissed altogether. A.I.M rallied the people at the Pine Ridge Reservation with red flags and drums and led a caravan of 200 cars to Gordon, Nebraska to demand justice. Sheriff deputies and FBI agents capitulated to their demands for more serious charges, the chief of police to be dismissed, and racism in Gordon to be investigated. In this way, AIM managed to gain the respect of traditional Indians at Pine Ridge. In 1972, a non-traditional Oglala man named Richard Dickey Wilson was elected to tribal chairman of the Pine Ridge Reservation. Wilson was an established and well-off businessman who owned a trucking company and several other interests. He had begun his life as an entrepreneur by bootlegging alcohol and selling it to fellow Indians. He began his term by giving tribal council salaries to his wife, brother, cousin, nephew, and his sons, in addition to putting about 900 of his supporters on government payroll. In addition to this, his government salary was about $15,000 on a reservation where the average income was $800. Wilson was militantly against the traditional people on the reservation, and even more militantly against AIM. During this time, Russell Means decided to return to Pine Ridge, and Wilson promptly banned AIM activities on the reservation. Wilson used federal money to arm a private police force called the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, called the Goon Squad by everybody else. Despite massive petitions to have him removed, some having more names than people who voted for Wilson, the FBI and the BIA fully backed him. In January of 1973, in Custer, South Dakota, a locally respected businessman named Darrell Schmidt decided that, in his words, he was going to kill him an Indian. That unfortunate Indian was named Wesley Bad Heart Bull, whom Schmidt murdered by stabbing him in the heart. In keeping with the established precedent, Schmidt was only charged with involuntary manslaughter. Wesley's distraught mother, Sarah Bad Heart Bull, asked AIM for help in seeking justice. On February 6, AIM mobilized 200 Indians and descended on Custer to attending a meeting to discuss this injustice. When they arrived, only a few designated leaders were allowed to enter, and when Sarah Bad Heart Bull attempted to enter, she was beaten by police. Indians who attempted to intervene were also beaten and gassed. A riot ensued. The murderer of Sarah's son would not serve a day in jail, but Sarah herself would be jailed for inciting a riot. The Custer riot was the first major outbreak of violence between white men and Lakota since the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1860. Consequently, with an eye to protecting private mining leases in the Black Hills, which AIM claims to national sovereignty would threaten, the Attorney General assigned 65 U.S. Marshals to the Pine Ridge Reservation. Meanwhile, impeachment proceedings were brought against Dick Wilson, which Wilson then dismissed himself. This, combined with the violent vigilante actions of the Goon Squad against Oglala traditionalists, caused the traditional chiefs at Pine Ridge to ask for AIM's help. AIM and the chiefs decided that what was to be done was to seize the town of Wounded Knee, the site of the 1890 massacre. This was done on February 27, 1973, not to let their demands be swept under the rug again, as the 20-point program was in D.C. The occupiers issued a statement saying that the government could either negotiate with them or kill all of them. AIM leader Carter Camp said that they wanted a true nation and not puppet governments set up by the BIA. Almost immediately, the feds surrounded Wounded Knee, armed with automatic weapons, armored personal vehicles, helicopters, and over 133,000 rounds for their M16s alone. The occupation lasted 71 days, with intermittent gunfire between occupiers and surrounding forces composed of the FBI, U.S. Marshals, and the Goons. March 10th was a day of ceasefire, but a van was intercepted by the FBI. An exchange of gunfire ensued. One FBI agent was wounded in the hand on that day. On March 22nd, the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Committee was formed to fight what they claimed was an illegal invasion on the reservation by federal forces. Dick Wilson, however, set up his own roadblocks and ransacked the lawyers' cars before they could get in. On March 26, fire erupted and a U.S. Marshal was seriously wounded, most likely by a stray bullet from the Goons, though 5 members of AIM were charged with the shooting. During all of this, the press tried to represent AIM as a rogue group of militants that don't represent the good Indians. It's just like the old days, said Means, except now they call us militants instead of hostiles or renegades. One of the newer AIM members at Wounded Knee was named Anna Mae Aquash. Anna Mae referred to herself as a female warrior and helped dig bunkers at Wounded Knee and smuggle in supplies. She had begun her involvement with AIM by teaching at one of the survivor schools. On April 5th, the delegation, including Russell Means, Leonard Crodog, and others, submitted themselves to arrest so that they could travel to Washington to negotiate. The main goal of the occupiers was to get the government to respect the Treaty of 1868, which, among other things, guaranteed the Lakota's right to the sacred Black Hills. The Congressional Act of 1871 was then used to nullify treaties made with Indian nations by claiming that Indian nations were part of the United States and the United States could not enforce treaties with itself. When Means and Crow Dog arrived in Washington, the authorities said that they refused to even discuss matters with them if their comrades at Wounded Knee were still armed. Means and Crow Dog were open, but asked if the federal agents would also agree to disarm. But of course, the government was having none of that, and negotiations were stalled from the get-go. On April 17th, another firefight breaks out, and occupier Frank Clearwater is killed by a stray bullet. The racist white press started calling for the immediate suppression of the Wounded Knee occupation. Even the peace-loving liberal George McGovern called for an immediate end to the situation, saying, "We cannot have one law for a handful of publicity-seeking militants and another law for ordinary citizens."